When the water vanished, the truth began to breathe. For 20 years, the Hartwells were just a town's sad bedtime story. The family who disappeared at the lake. A cautionary tale about safety, about keeping doors locked, about the strange things that can happen even in places we think we know. But the drought of 2023 changed everything. When the lake bottom cracked open, it didn't just reveal something, it remembered something. Tom Berenger never intended to make history that July morning. The 67-year-old retired postal worker had spent most of his life fishing the waters of Larkspur Lake, learning its moods and secrets since he was old enough to hold a rod. But as he walked across the cracked mud where gentle waves once lapped, he became the first person in 20 years to lay eyes on the Hartwell family secret. "I thought it was just some piece of farm equipment at first," he would later tell reporters, his weathered hand still trembling slightly at the memory. "Something that fell off a boat years ago. But then I saw the curve of it. Unmistakable. That was a car roof." The drought had pulled back the curtain on Oregon's deepest lake by nearly 30 feet, exposing a muddy graveyard of lost fishing gear, beer cans, and decades of human carelessness. But 200 yards from what used to be the old dock, half buried in silt and wrapped in lake weeds, sat something much larger. The corroded shell of a 2002 Ford Explorer, its blue paint barely visible beneath a crust of sediment and time. Within hours, state police had cordoned off the area. By nightfall, everyone in Larkspur Cove knew. The Hartwells had been found, or at least their vehicle had. Elena Hartwell sat alone in her rental car, parked at the edge of the police cordon. At 35, her face still carried traces of the 15-year-old girl who had missed that fateful weekend at the lake because of a summer flu. The girl whose entire family disappeared without a trace while she recovered at her aunt's house 60 miles away. She watched through the windshield as divers in black wetsuits moved around the exposed SUV, now partly excavated from its muddy tomb. Their movements were deliberate, reverent almost, the kind of careful choreography reserved for grave sites, because that's what this was. Elena had known it for 20 years, even when others speculated about voluntary disappearances or spontaneous relocations. Even when well-meaning neighbors suggested her family might someday return with an explanation. She knew they were dead the moment Sheriff Campbell came to Aunt Margaret's door that Monday morning, hat in hand, eyes unable to meet hers. Elena hadn't been to Larkspur Cove since she turned 18. The town had taken everything from her. Why give it anything more? But the call from Detective Samuel Horn 2 days ago had broken through 20 years of carefully constructed distance. "They've found the car, Elena. We need you here." So she came. Not for closure. She had never believed in such convenient psychological packaging, but for truth. The thing that had been submerged alongside her family for 2 decades. A knock on her window startled her. Samuel Horn stood outside, older now, his once black hair streaked with gray, but still bearing the same steady eyes that had questioned her all those years ago. She rolled down the window. "They're bringing it up now," he said quietly. "Thought you might want to be closer." Elena nodded and stepped out of the car. Together, they walked toward the lake's edge, except there was no longer an edge, just a gradual slope of cracked earth stretching toward the distant water. "I always knew they were here," she said. Horn nodded. "We searched the lake back then, but the technology wasn't what it is now, and the lake's deep, over 100 feet in parts, and what?" Elena asked. "And I think some people didn't want to look too hard." She turned to him, surprised by his candor. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've carried it for 20 years, and I'm tired, and because you deserve the truth." He gestured toward the excavation site where cables strained against motorized winches, All of it. The SUV emerged from its resting place like a relic from another era, which in many ways it was. Water and mud cascaded from its frame as it rose, revealing crushed windows and a crumpled hood. The rear of the vehicle had been damaged, not by the lake, Elena realized, but by impact. She felt her throat tighten. Was it an accident? She whispered, though she already knew the answer. Horn's voice was flat. No, Elena, I don't think it was. Larkspur Cove had always been a place where water and forest met in peaceful coexistence, a scenic dot on Oregon's northern landscape, the kind of town tourists discovered by accident and locals guarded jealously, with just enough amenities to be comfortable, but not enough to attract developers. At least, that had been true until Richard Vail arrived in 2001 with dreams of transforming the sleepy lakeside community into a premium resort destination. Before the drought, before the SUV, before the Hartwells disappeared, there had been town hall meetings and property disputes. Robert Hartwell, a civil engineer with an environmental conscience, had been one of the most vocal opponents of Vail's proposed marina expansion. They were the perfect family, Ellen McCready told the documentary crew that had descended on the town after the discovery. As the Hartwells' next-door neighbor for 5 years, she had been the one to report them missing when their newspapers piled up. 2 beautiful children, a gorgeous lake house. Robert was so principled, and Lori made the best blueberry muffins you've ever tasted. They were just perfect. But perfection, as Elena had learned, was often a carefully maintained facade. The archival footage from July 2003 showed the Hartwell family in sunshine. 12-year-old Claire, with her father's smile and curious eyes, 8-year-old Daniel clutching a plastic dinosaur, Robert at the grill, and Lori laughing with a glass of wine. Their last documented weekend alive. I remember waving to them as they drove up Friday afternoon, Ellen continued, her eyes now watery with 2 decades of hindsight. Claire was so excited about something. She kept bouncing in her seat. And Robert, well, looking back, I guess he seemed tense. But I didn't think anything of it at the time. What no one mentioned in the original investigation was the dock light that stayed on all night. A detail confirmed by 3 separate neighbors but never entered into official records. Or the shouting that Thomas Granger heard across the water at approximately 1:30 a.m. A man's voice, angry, then a woman crying. Or how Robert Hartwell had been seen walking alone along the shoreline at 2:15 a.m., flashlight in hand, as if searching for something. Or someone. I thought maybe their dog had gotten out, Granger admitted. It didn't seem important enough to tell the police back then. But it was the clock that haunted Elena most, the one detail everyone remembered from the initial investigation. The antique mantel clock in the living room stopped at precisely 7:42 a.m. Its battery hadn't died. Someone had deliberately pulled the hands to stop it. A frozen moment. The time of death, she had always thought. But whose? The second day of excavation revealed what Elena had both dreaded and expected: human remains inside the vehicle. 2 sets, both adult-sized, still secured by seatbelts. The news hit Larkspur Cove like a physical blow, forcing the town to confront what many had suspected but few had voiced. The perfect family had met a violent end, and the lake had kept their secret for 2 decades. Initial forensic assessment confirmed the identities of Elena's parents, Robert and Lori Hartwell. But the children were not in the vehicle. No trace of Claire or Daniel had been found. The car didn't just roll into the lake, Horn explained as they stood at the makeshift command center established in the town's community hall. Maps and photographs covered a large table, the visual timeline of a 20-year-old case suddenly active again. The impact damage to the rear suggests it was pushed, and both victims show signs of head trauma inconsistent with drowning or a standard vehicle accident. They were murdered, Elena said flatly. Horn nodded, and then made to look like an accident, except no one was meant to find them, at least not for a very long time. What about Claire and Daniel? If they weren't in the car, we don't know yet. Horn hesitated. But I think it's time we revisit the lake house. The original investigation may have missed something. Elena felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She hadn't set foot in her childhood home since the day before her family left for that final weekend. The weekend her flu had saved her life. For years, she'd driven past it on visits to her aunt, watching as it was briefly repossessed, then sold, renovated, and eventually abandoned again as Larkspur Cove's real estate fortunes rose and fell. "Is it still standing?" she asked. "Yes. The last owners foreclosed in 2015. It's been empty since then, frozen in time, like everything else in this case. Like her family, like the truth, like the hands of that stopped clock." "Let's go," she said. The Hartwell Lake House stood at the end of Pinecrest Road, partially obscured by 20 years of neglected landscaping. Once manicured hedges had grown wild, climbing the white clapboard siding like reaching fingers. The blue trim Robert had meticulously repainted each spring was now peeling and faded. Nature was slowly reclaiming what had once been pristine. Elena felt her heart rate quicken as they approached. Every detail triggered a memory. The porch swing where her mother had read to them on summer evenings, the curved driveway where she'd learned to ride a bike, the large bay window where the family Christmas tree had stood each December. "You okay?" Horn asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. A crime scene technician met them at the door, key in hand. "We've done a preliminary sweep. The place is secure but pretty much untouched since the last owners left. Lots of dust, some minor water damage in the kitchen. Electricity's been shut off for years." The door creaked open, revealing a time capsule of abandoned lives. Generic furniture left behind by the last owners mixed with forgotten remnants of the Hartwell family. A child's drawing still pinned to the bulletin board in the kitchen. A row of seashells lined up on a windowsill. A faded university pennant that had somehow remained when everything of obvious value had been removed. Elena moved through the space like a ghost, touching nothing but seeing everything. The breakfast nook where Claire had done her homework, the living room where Daniel had built elaborate dinosaur worlds, the spot where the stopped clock had stood. The attic was never properly searched, Horn said quietly, disrupting her memories. The original team did a walkthrough, but records show they were called to another location before they could do a thorough examination. By the time they returned, the focus of the investigation had shifted to possible voluntary disappearance. "You think there's something up there? I think we owe it to your family to look everywhere." The pull-down attic stairs protested with years of disuse as Horn tugged them free. Dust rained down, dancing in the beams of their flashlights. Elena followed him up into the darkness, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The attic was stifling, the July heat concentrated under the roof. Boxes and forgotten items created shadowy silhouettes, a child's bicycle, Christmas decorations, a stack of board games. Ordinary things that now seemed charged with significance. "There," Horn said, pointing his flashlight toward a small wooden chest tucked under the eaves. A name had been carved into its lid: Claire. Elena moved toward it as if in a trance. Her sister's treasure box. The place where 12-year-old Claire had kept her most precious possessions. Special rocks, friendship bracelets, secret notes. Elena remembered being furiously jealous of it once, back when such things seemed important. "Should I?" she asked, hands hovering over the latch. Horn nodded. "It's your family's property." The latch gave way easily. Inside, amid the expected childhood treasures, lay a journal bound in faded blue cloth. Elena recognized it immediately. The diary she had given Claire for her 12th birthday, just months before the disappearance. She wrote in it, Elena whispered, lifting it carefully. The pages were stiff but intact, protected from the elements in the sealed chest. Together, they descended to the kitchen, where natural light made reading possible. Elena placed the journal on the table and carefully opened it. Claire's neat handwriting filled page after page, ordinary reflections of a 12-year-old's life until May 2003, when the tone changed. May 12th, 2003. Dad was on the phone again with Mr. Vale. He sounded really angry. Mom made me and Daniel go outside, but I could still hear him. Something about legal obligations and original agreement. When he finished, Mom was crying in their room. Dad sat on the porch for a long time without talking to anyone. Elena turned the pages, her hands trembling slightly. June 3rd, 2003. Mr. Vale came to the house today with another man in a suit. They stayed in Dad's office for 2 hours. When they left, Dad slammed the door so hard the pictures rattled. At dinner, he said we might have to move away from the lake. Daniel cried. June 20th, 2003. Dad got mail from someone called Bedford and Associates. He took it straight to his office without opening it. Mom looks worried all the time now. The entries continued, a child's perspective on mounting tension. Then came the final entry, dated July 25th, 2003, the day before the family left for their last weekend at the lake house. July 25th, 2003. We're going to the lake tomorrow. Dad says it might be our last trip there, so we should enjoy it. He seems different lately, like he's planning something important. Last night I heard him tell Mom that water keeps secrets better than people do. I don't know what that means, but it scared me. I'm taking this journal with me. Maybe the entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The rest of the pages remained blank. Water keeps secrets better than people do, Elena repeated, the words sending a chill through her despite the summer heat. He knew something was going to happen. Horn carefully photographed each page of the journal. This changes everything, he said. This isn't just about the car anymore. This is about premeditation, conspiracy. And Richard Vale, Elena finished. Claire mentions him by name. Multiple times. Vale is still alive, Horn said, his voice hardening. Retired now, but still owns half the commercial property around the lake. We're going to need to talk to him. Elena closed the journal gently, as if putting her sister to rest. Claire knew something was wrong. She was trying to document it in her own way. Kids often see more than we give them credit for, Horn agreed, and sometimes they're the only ones telling the truth when adults are busy lying. As they prepared to leave, Elena paused in Claire's old bedroom, now stripped bare except for a basic metal frame where her canopy bed had once stood. She ran her fingers along the windowsill, remembering how her sister used to sit there with a book, claiming it had the best reading light in the house. Something caught her attention. A small carving in the wood, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. 2 sets of initials, CH plus DH, Claire and Daniel Hartwell. Beneath them, crudely etched but unmistakable, a clock face, its hands pointing to 7:42. Richard Vale's estate occupied the highest point overlooking Larkspur Lake, a modernist glass and stone monument to wealth that locals had come to call the Observatory. At 72, Vale had the lean, preserved look of the wealthy, tanned skin, carefully maintained silver hair, and the sharp eyes of a predator who had never lost his edge. Detective Horn, he greeted them at the door, his smile not reaching his eyes. And Miss Hartwell, what an unexpected surprise. Please come in. The living room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the drought-stricken lake. Elena couldn't help noticing that from this vantage point, the excavation site where her parents' car had been found was clearly visible. I was sorry to hear about the discovery, Vale said, his tone carefully measured. A tragic end to a long mystery. Is it the end, Mr. Vale? Elena asked before Horn could speak, because I think it might be just the beginning. If the directness of her question surprised him, Vale didn't show it. He gestured for them to sit while remaining standing himself, a power move that Elena recognized from her years as a corporate attorney. "I'm not sure I follow," he said. Horn placed Claire's journal on the glass coffee table between them. "We've found new evidence, suggesting that Robert Hartwell was in a serious dispute with you in the months before his disappearance. A dispute about property rights and development plans that he was opposing." Vale's expression didn't change, but Elena noticed his hands, a slight tightening of his fingers around the back of the chair he stood behind. "Robert and I had our professional disagreements, certainly. He was an idealist about environmental conservation. I was, still am, a pragmatist about economic growth. But that was 20 years ago, and hardly relevant to whatever unfortunate accident befell the family." "It wasn't an accident," Elena said, flatly. "My parents were murdered before the car went into the lake, and Claire and Daniel aren't in the vehicle. They're still missing." For the first time, Vale seemed genuinely startled. "The children weren't found? I had assumed—" "No," Horn interrupted, "and we have evidence suggesting Robert Hartwell knew he and his family were in danger. References to threats, legal pressures, and specifically, to you." Vale moved to a sideboard and poured himself a glass of water, his back to them for a moment. When he turned, his composure had returned. "Detective, these are serious implications. I hope you have more than a child's diary to support them." "We're just getting started," Horn said. "Tell me about Bedford and Associates." The question landed like a physical blow. Vale's glass paused halfway to his lips. "A law firm I used occasionally? They specialized in real estate transactions." "And the original agreement? The one Robert referenced in his phone call with you?" Vale set his glass down carefully. "You're asking me to recall specific conversations from 2 decades ago." "Try," Elena said, her voice hard. Vale's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your father and I had an understanding when he first purchased that lake house. The property included certain access rights to the North Shore, rights that would eventually be critical to my marina development. He initially agreed to sell those rights back to me when the time came. Later, he changed his mind." "Because he discovered your development would damage the lake ecosystem?" Elena pressed. "Because he became unreasonable," Vale countered. "I offered him 3 times market value. He refused. Then he began rallying other homeowners against the project, costing me millions in delays and redesigns." He gestured toward the window. "Look at it now. The lake is dying anyway, not from development, but from climate change. All that righteousness, and for what?" Horn leaned forward. "Mr. Vale, where were you the night of July 26, 2003? Vale smiled thinly. "Am I a suspect, detective? Because if so, I should contact my attorney." "Just establishing a timeline," Horn said smoothly. "I was hosting a fundraiser for the governor at the West Ridge Country Club. 200 witnesses, including the chief of police at the time. Does that satisfy your timeline?" It was the perfect alibi, and from Vale's satisfied expression, he knew it. But Elena hadn't spent 10 years in corporate law without learning to recognize when someone was hiding behind technicalities. "You didn't have to be there personally," she said quietly. "Men like you rarely do their own dirty work." Vale turned to her, something dangerous flickering in his eyes before being quickly suppressed. "Miss Hartwell, I understand you're grieving. Again. But these accusations are not only baseless, they're potentially libelous. I've spent 20 years building Larkspur Cove into a destination that provides jobs and opportunities for hundreds of families. Your parents' tragedy, while unfortunate, has nothing to do with me." Elena stood matching his height. "My sister mentioned someone else in her journal, a man in a suit who came with you to meet my father. Who was he?" For a moment, Vale seemed to calculate his response. Thomas Riddleman, my security consultant at the time. And where is he now? Unfortunately deceased. A boating accident in 2008. How convenient, Elena thought. But she kept her face neutral. We'll need his employment records. Of course, my office will provide whatever you need, with the proper legal requests. Vale moved toward the door, clearly ending the conversation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call scheduled. Outside in the car, Elena finally released the breath she'd been holding. He's lying. Of course he is, Horn agreed, starting the engine. But proving it is another matter. His alibi for that night will check out. I already verified it years ago. Then we need to find out more about Thomas Riddleman, Elena said. And we need to understand what happened to Claire and Daniel. Horn nodded grimly. I think it's time we examine that car more closely. The forensic team should be finished with their preliminary analysis by now. As they drove away, Elena glanced back at Vale's estate. From this angle, all she could see was the reflection of the sky in its glass walls, revealing nothing of what lay within. The county morgue was housed in the basement of Larkspur Memorial Hospital, a sterile space of gleaming tiles and the sharp scent of disinfectant. Dr. Mariana Santos, the forensic pathologist, met them outside the examination room where the remains of Robert and Lori Hartwell had been processed. I've been working cold cases for 15 years, she told them, her dark eyes serious behind protective glasses. But this is exceptional preservation. The depth and temperature of the lake essentially created a controlled environment, limiting decomposition and protecting evidence that would normally be lost to time. She led them to a laboratory where photographs and digital scans covered the walls, X-rays of fractured skulls, close-ups of preserved fabric, 3D renderings of the vehicle's position on the lake bed. Both victims suffered blunt force trauma to the base of the skull, Dr. Santos explained, pointing to the relevant images. The injuries are nearly identical, suggesting the same weapon and assailant. The force was delivered from behind, consistent with someone standing outside the vehicle while the victims were seated. They were knocked unconscious and then driven into the lake? Elena asked, her voice steady despite the horror of discussing her parents' murders so clinically. Not exactly, Santos replied. Toxicology shows high levels of sedatives in both victims, enough to render them unconscious or at least severely impaired. The head injuries came after they were already incapacitated. Someone drugged them first, Horn said, then struck them to ensure they wouldn't regain consciousness, and ensured the cause of death would look like drowning if the bodies were ever found, Santos added. Except for one problem, Robert Hartwell's seatbelt was unbuckled and then rebuckled across his unconscious body. The pattern of abrasion on the belt mechanism shows it was manipulated after he was already injured. Elena felt her stomach twist. They weren't driving when the car went into the lake. No, Santos confirmed. They were passengers in their own murder. Horn moved closer to the vehicle images. What about the children? Any evidence they were in the car? That's where it gets interesting, Santos said, guiding them to another set of photographs. We found children's clothing in the trunk, a girl's sweater, a boy's tennis shoe, but no physical evidence they were wearing these items when they went into the water. No bodily fluids, no hair, no skin cells. Plants, Elena whispered. Santos nodded. That's my assessment. Someone put those items there to suggest the children were also victims of the same incident, but the trunk hatch shows signs of being opened underwater, which would be impossible if the car simply rolled or was pushed into the lake in one event. Someone returned to the scene, Horn said, after the car was already submerged. And they brought children's clothing with them, Elena finished, feeling ill, to make it look like Claire and Daniel died with my parents. But why? Horn asked. If they wanted to fake the children's deaths, why not just put them in the car from the beginning? The answer came to Elena with sudden, terrible clarity. Because they weren't dead yet. Claire and Daniel weren't part of the original plan. Santos directed their attention to another set of evidence photographs, these showing the shoreline from 20 years ago, preserved in the original case files. The initial investigation documented footprints leading to the dock, she explained. 3 sets of adult prints and 1 child's. The assumption was that the family had taken their boat out, but when the boat wasn't found, investigators theorized it might have sunk accidentally or been taken by the perpetrators. But the boat was never found, Horn added. Not in 20 years of people using that lake. Because it wasn't in the lake, Elena said, studying the photographs. These footprints, they don't match our family. My father wore size 11 boots. These are at least size 13. Santos nodded approvingly. Exactly. And look at the depth and pattern. These aren't people walking normally. These are staged impressions. Someone deliberately created these tracks after the fact, probably to suggest the family had walked to the dock willingly. The whole scene was staged, Horn muttered. The clock stopped at 7:42, the footprints, the missing boat. But they made mistakes, Elena said. They didn't know what size shoes my father wore. They didn't anticipate that the lake level would ever drop enough to expose the car. And they didn't expect Claire to leave a journal recording her suspicions. Dr. Santos pulled up one final image on her tablet, a sonar scan of the northern section of the lake, taken during the initial search for the Hartwell's missing boat. This was dismissed at the time because the resolution wasn't clear enough to determine what it showed, she explained. But I had our tech team enhance it using modern software. The enhanced image revealed what appeared to be an underwater road, a man-made path that extended from the north shore into deeper water, ending near where the Hartwell's SUV had been found. That's not on any official map of the lake, Horn said, frowning. No, Santos agreed, but it aligns perfectly with Vail's proposed marina development, the one that was approved 6 months after the Hartwells disappeared. Elena stared at the image, her mind racing. They expanded the lake. After my family disappeared, they deliberately flooded more land, covering the evidence and creating the marina access Vail wanted all along. We need to find out exactly when that expansion happened, Horn said, and we need to search that underwater road. If the children weren't in the car... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. If Claire and Daniel hadn't died with their parents, then what had happened to them? And why stage such an elaborate cover-up? As they left the morgue, Elena's phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. She tried to warn you. The clock doesn't lie. North Shore, 7:42. The message came from Mara Vail, Richard's estranged daughter. They met at a coffee shop 40 miles from Larkspur Cove, away from curious eyes. At 38, Mara had her father's sharp features, but none of his calculated coldness. Her hands shook slightly as she placed a manila envelope on the table. I found these last year when I was cleaning out my mother's storage unit after she died, she explained. She left my father in 2005, but she kept insurance, I guess you could call it. Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents bearing the Bedford and Associates letterhead, legal correspondence addressed to Richard Vail regarding the Larkspur North Shore Acquisition Project. Most were standard legal jargon about property rights and zoning changes, but one memo stood out. Dated July 15, 2003, 11 days before the Hartwells disappeared, it referenced continued resistance from Hartwell property and suggested alternative approaches to securing necessary access rights. My father always gets what he wants, Mara said quietly, one way or another. When I was young, I thought that was a sign of strength. Now I know it's just the privilege of wealth and the absence of conscience. Did you ever meet Thomas Riddleman? Elena asked. Mara's expression darkened. Everyone said his boating accident was ironic. The security expert who didn't secure his life vest properly. But I remember how my father reacted when he got the call. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even upset. He just said, "Make sure the insurance pays out to his designated beneficiary." No questions about what happened. You think your father had him killed? I think Riddleman knew things that made him dangerous, Mara replied carefully. Just like your father did. Elena studied the documents again. These are helpful, but they don't prove direct involvement in my family's deaths. There's something else, Mara said, lowering her voice. Something my mother told me before she died. The night your family disappeared, my father didn't attend the governor's fundraiser until after 9 p.m. His alibi covers the evening, but not the morning, not 7:42 a.m., when that clock was stopped. Horn leaned forward. How can we verify this? My mother kept a diary too, Mara said with a sad smile. She documented everything, partly out of loneliness, partly for protection. It's all in there, including the fact that she woke up alone that morning and my father didn't return until almost noon. When she asked where he'd been, he said he'd gone fishing. Richard Vale doesn't fish, Elena said, remembering a detail from Claire's journal. My sister mentioned that, how he'd refused my father's invitation to join him on the lake because he had no patience for sitting still. Exactly, Mara confirmed. It was such an obvious lie that my mother wrote it down, along with the fact that his clothes smelled like earth and chemicals, not fish or lake water. Earth and chemicals, Horn repeated thoughtfully, like someone who had been digging or handling construction materials. Or expanding a lake shoreline, Elena added, the pieces beginning to align in her mind. The three of them pored over the documents and Mara's notes for another hour, constructing a timeline that contradicted Vale's perfect alibi. As they prepared to leave, Mara handed Elena one last item, a photograph of Richard Vale with Thomas Riddleman, taken at what appeared to be a construction site. This was at the North Shore expansion, she explained, taken in August 2003, just weeks after your family disappeared. Look at what's on the ground behind them. Elena studied the image. In the background, partially obscured by construction equipment, was a child's bicycle, the same distinctive blue as the one Daniel had received for his 8th birthday. My brother's bike, she whispered. They were there. Horn took the photograph, his expression grim. We need to search the North Shore, not just the lake, but the land that was flooded afterward. There's one more thing you should know, Mara said as they stood to leave. The expansion project was rushed through, permitting in record time. The work that should have taken months was done in weeks, and the foreman who supervised it, a man named Carl Redman, quit immediately afterward, moved to Alaska, never came back. Can we find him? Elena asked Horn. We can try, he replied. But first, I want to know what's at the North Shore. Your text message mentioned 742 specifically. What's significant about that location at that time? Mara looked uncomfortable. It's just something my mother mentioned once. At 7:42 a.m., on a clear day, there's a moment when the sun reflects off the water at just the right angle to illuminate the entrance to the old service tunnel. It's part of the original dam infrastructure, sealed off decades ago, but my father had it reopened during the expansion, then closed again afterward. A tunnel that runs under the North Shore, Elena said, the implications sending a chill through her. That's what my sister was trying to tell me with the clock carving. Not when, where. The North Shore of Larkspur Lake had once been a gentle slope of pines, leading to a pebbly beach. Now, after 20 years of development and weeks of drought, it was almost unrecognizable, a marina complex of concrete and steel that extended into water too shallow for most boats to navigate. Elena and Horn arrived at precisely 7:30 a.m. the next morning, accompanied by two officers from the state police and a geologist from the university who specialized in subterranean structures. They parked in the nearly empty marina lot and made their way to the shore, following Mara's carefully drawn map. "If her information is correct," Horn said, checking his watch, "we should see the entrance at exactly 7:42, when the sun hits the water at the right angle." The minutes ticked by slowly. Elena felt her heart pounding, a mix of dread and determination pushing away the exhaustion of a sleepless night. At 7:40, the sun broke through a bank of clouds, sending golden light streaming across the drought-diminished lake. "There," the geologist said suddenly, pointing toward what appeared to be a simple concrete drainage structure half hidden by decorative boulders. "That's not original shoreline architecture. That was added later." As the sun rose higher, its rays struck the water at precisely the angle Mara had described. For just a few moments, the reflection illuminated the drainage opening, revealing that it was much larger than it appeared, its true dimensions disguised by carefully positioned rocks. "That's no drainage pipe," Horn said grimly. "That's an access tunnel." Within minutes, the team had removed the false grate covering the entrance. Behind it lay a padlocked steel door, corroded but intact. The lock gave way easily to the specialized tools the officers had brought. "The tunnel was part of the original dam construction," the geologist explained as they prepared to enter. "Used for maintenance and emergency access. According to records, it was permanently sealed in 1982 after several flooding incidents. But this door is much newer, probably installed during Vale's expansion project." Horn distributed flashlights and masks. "Stay together. This structure hasn't been properly assessed for stability." The tunnel stretched before them, a concrete throat descending beneath the lake. The air was damp and stale, carrying the mineral scent of long-standing water. Their footsteps echoed against the curved walls, creating disorienting ripples of sound. "The main tunnel should extend about a quarter mile," the geologist said, consulting her tablet. "But there could be secondary chambers or maintenance rooms branching off." They proceeded slowly, testing each step. The floor was slick with condensation, but the structure itself seemed sound. After about 200 yards, the main passage opened into a larger chamber, clearly modified from its original purpose. Wooden shelving lined one wall. A folding table stood in the center, covered with a layer of dust so thick it obscured whatever lay beneath it. "This was used recently," one of the officers observed, pointing to electrical outlets that had been added to the walls. "There's a modern junction box here, not original equipment." Elena moved toward the shelves, her flashlight revealing stacks of plastic containers, their contents hidden behind cloudy surfaces. With gloved hands, she carefully lifted one down and opened it. Inside were children's clothes, neatly folded, preserved in the cool, dry environment of the sealed tunnel. A girl's jeans with embroidered flowers on the pockets. A boy's red sweater with a dinosaur patch. "Claire's," Elena whispered, touching the jeans. "And Daniel's. I remember these. Mom bought them for back to school, just weeks before." She couldn't finish the sentence. Horn moved beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder before examining the container more carefully. "These aren't just random clothes," he said. "These are complete outfits, multiple sets, like someone was keeping them here for extended use." The implications hung in the air, too terrible to voice immediately. "Over here," called one of the officers from the far end of the chamber. "There's another door." This one wasn't locked. It swung open easily, revealing a smaller room that sent Elena staggering back in horror. 2 small beds, a shelf of books and toys, a portable chemical toilet, a plastic bin containing granola bars and water bottles, long expired, and on the wall, childish drawings. Scenes of a house, a family, a lake. Drawings signed in careful script, Claire H. and Daniel H. They were kept here, Elena said, her voice breaking. After my parents were killed, they were held prisoner in this tomb. Horn was already examining the room with professional detachment, though his face had paled. Not just held, cared for in a twisted way. There are books, toys, even art supplies. Whoever put them here wanted them alive and occupied. For how long? Elena asked, the question tearing from her throat. We'll need to process everything, Horn replied gently. But based on the number of drawings and the different styles as they developed, I'd estimate at least several months. Months, Elena echoed. The word hollow in the underground chamber. My brother and sister were trapped underground for months while everyone thought they'd drowned with my parents. The geologist who had been examining the structure of the second room called their attention to another discovery. There's a third chamber beyond this one, but the door appears to have been sealed from this side. It took the combined strength of both officers to force the final door open. What lay beyond confirmed Elena's worst fears. Two small forms, skeletal but still recognizable as children, lay side by side on a single mattress. They were covered with a blanket, their hands positioned as if holding each other in sleep. Beside them, a flashlight with long dead batteries, a notebook, and a plastic water bottle, empty except for a folded piece of paper inside. Elena fell to her knees, a sound of pure anguish tearing from her throat. Horn knelt beside her, his own composure finally cracking. I'm so sorry, Elena, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Later, when she could breathe again, when the initial shock had hardened into a grief so deep it transformed into something like clarity, Elena asked to see the note from the bottle. Written in Claire's familiar handwriting, but more mature, more desperate than the journal entries, it told the final chapter of the Hartwell tragedy. To whoever finds us, my name is Claire Hartwell. I am 12 years old. My brother Daniel is 8. We have been kept in these rooms since our parents were killed. We don't know who did it, but we heard them talking about our dad refusing to sell something. The men who bring food stopped coming 3 days ago. The lights went out. Daniel is very sick. The door to the outer room is locked now. We can't get out. If you're reading this, please tell our sister Elena we love her. Please tell her we tried to be brave. The water keeps secrets, but paper remembers. Claire. The note was dated October 18th, 2003, nearly 3 months after the Hartwells had disappeared. Richard Vale was arrested at his estate that afternoon, the warrant executed by state police rather than local authorities. The charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder for Robert and Lori Hartwell, 2 counts of kidnapping and murder for Claire and Daniel Hartwell, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and environmental crimes related to the illegal lake expansion. The evidence recovered from the tunnel was damning. Fingerprints matching Vale's were found on the electrical junction box. His DNA was on the children's food containers. Most damning of all, Claire's notebook contained detailed descriptions of her interactions with the man from Dad's office, Richard Vale himself, who had visited them several times in their underground prison. But the most shocking revelation came from Carl Redman, the construction foreman who had supervised the North Shore expansion, located in Anchorage, Alaska. After a nationwide search, he provided a videotaped statement that filled in the final gaps. Vale and Riddleman handled the Hartwells themselves, he explained, his face gray with 2 decades of guilt. They drugged the parents first, early that morning. Then they staged that scene at the house, the clock, the breakfast table. They drove the SUV into the lake using the old service road, but the kids weren't part of the original plan. According to Redman, Claire and Daniel had been hiding in the boathouse when Vale and Riddleman arrived. They witnessed everything. their parents being carried unconscious to the car, the vehicle being driven into the lake, the men returning to shore. Vale couldn't bring himself to kill children directly, Redmond continued, so he came up with a solution. The service tunnel was already scheduled to be resealed after the expansion. He had Riddleman move the children there, told them their parents had been taken to a hospital, that they needed to stay hidden because of bad men, who might come after them too. For months, Riddleman had been assigned to provide food and basic care for the children, a task he apparently performed with detached efficiency until Vale decided the risk was too great. "I was told they'd been relocated," Redmond said, his voice breaking. "I never knew they were sealed inside. I swear to God, I never knew." The final piece came from Thomas Riddleman's widow, who broke her silence after learning of Vale's arrest. She had found her husband's journal after his accident, a record of the tasks Vale had assigned him, including the gradual reduction of food deliveries to the tunnel, and finally the order to seal the inner door, trapping Claire and Daniel in the third chamber with limited supplies. "Tom couldn't live with what he'd done," she said. "He was going to confess. The night before his accident, he told me everything. The next day, Vale invited him out on the lake. Only Vale came back." With the evidence mounting and former associates turning against him, Vale finally broke. His confession, recorded in the county jail, revealed the cold calculation behind the tragedy. Hartwell was going to destroy everything, he said, his voice oddly calm. 20 years of planning, millions in investment. He found irregularities in the environmental impact studies, fabricated data that made the marina project possible. He was going to expose it all. As for the children, Vale claimed their deaths were regrettable but necessary. "I gave them more time than their parents got," he said, as if this represented some form of mercy. "But they'd seen too much, and children talk." "Why not just pay them off?" the interviewer asked. "You had millions." Vale's answer was as simple as it was chilling. "Hartwell couldn't be bought. I assumed his children would be the same. Some people's principles make them dangerous." The autumn rains came early to Larkspur Cove that year. By October, the lake had begun to rise again, water slowly reclaiming the exposed shoreline. Nature, as it always does, was erasing the visible scars of human interference, covering the drought-cracked earth with the gentle persistence of water. Elena stood at the end of the rebuilt dock, watching ripples spread across the surface. Behind her, the lake house, her family's home, now hers again, stood freshly painted against the darkening sky. She had decided to keep it, though she wasn't sure she would ever live there permanently. Some ghosts needed to be acknowledged, not avoided. Richard Vale's trial had been brief. Faced with overwhelming evidence and abandoned by former allies, he had accepted a plea agreement, 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. His financial empire had crumbled as investigations revealed decades of corruption, environmental crimes, and fraud. The marina complex was being dismantled, the shoreline restored to its natural state. Thomas Riddleman's death had been officially reclassified as homicide, another crime added to Vale's legacy. Carl Redmond had received immunity in exchange for his testimony, though Elena suspected his conscience would punish him more effectively than any legal system could. The Hartwell family had finally been laid to rest together, in a private ceremony attended by Elena, her aunt, and a few close friends. Claire and Daniel's remains had been recovered from the tunnel, along with all their possessions. The drawings, the toys, the notebook that had revealed Vale's visits. These items were now preserved as evidence of unimaginable cruelty, but also of extraordinary courage. 2 children who had comforted each other in darkness, who had tried to document the truth even as hope faded. Detective Samuel Horn joined Elena on the dock, his presence quiet but supportive. He had postponed his retirement to see the case through to ensure that justice, however delayed, was finally served. The medical examiner finished her report, he said gently. She believes Claire and Daniel survived for nearly 15 weeks after being sealed in that final chamber. They rationed their water, conserved the batteries in their flashlight. They took care of each other until the very end. Elena nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The thought of her siblings' suffering was a weight she would carry forever. But there was something else beneath the pain. A fierce pride in their resilience, their determination to bear witness even when no one could hear them. Claire knew, she said finally. She knew someone would find them eventually. That's why she wrote everything down. That's why she put that note in the bottle. She was extraordinary, Horn agreed. They both were. In the distance, lights were beginning to appear along the shoreline, homes and businesses settling into evening routines. The town was healing slowly, reconciling itself to the knowledge that it had harbored a monster in its midst for decades. Some residents had moved away, unable to face the complicity of silence. Others had stayed, determined to rebuild something better. "What will you do now?" Horn asked. Elena took a deep breath, tasting pine and water on the evening air. "Live," she said simply. "Remember, make sure nothing like this ever happens again, at least not here." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the worn blue diary that had started everything, Claire's journal, with its innocent observations and terrible warnings. "My sister wrote that water keeps secrets, but paper remembers." She was right about that. But I think there's more to it. Elena looked out over the lake, its surface now perfectly still, reflecting the first stars of evening. Water doesn't just keep secrets. Eventually, it gives them back. As if in agreement, a gentle wave lapped against the dock pilings. The drought had ended. The lake was returning to its natural boundaries, and the truth, hidden for 20 years beneath its surface, had finally risen to the light. "The water will return," Elena murmured. "The silence won't." Behind her, the lake house windows glowed warm against the gathering darkness, no longer empty, no longer forgotten. And somewhere beneath the gentle surface of the water, the old service road continued its quiet dissolution, returning to the earth from which it had been carved. One more secret surrendered by the passage of time. The clock that had stopped at 7:42 on that fateful morning now ticked steadily on Elena's mantle, marking seconds, minutes, hours, each one a small victory over the silence that had nearly buried her family forever. Time moved forward, water rose, truth endured, and the shadows beneath the water, at last, began to fade